Okay, so some of the other similarities and differences between Canadians and Americans. So, Canadians actually know a lot more about the US and American people than vice versa. American people do not know too much about Canada or Canadian people. I think one of the reasons for that might be because there's a lot of TV channels being played and being watched by Canadians, and because there's the big cities and big towns in Canada are actually right by the US border. So the Canadian cities and urban centers are actually quite close to the US, and they're quite far from each other. So you see Canadian people cross the border all the time into the US and go within the specific region. For example, more people probably go from Vancouver to Seattle than they do from Vancouver to Calgary, for example. It's harder to travel within Canada, and sometimes to go from one Canadian city to another city, for example, going from Vancouver to Toronto, you might actually have to cross the US because it's a lot faster going through the US as opposed to Canada. So I believe that Canadians have a lot more knowledge about the US and about American people than vice versa. Unfortunately, they do not have the correct knowledge, or they only have the knowledge that is negative about American people. They don't see the positive side of Americans as much. So that's because US media is predominantly presenting negative news. So they see all this negativity about the US and they pride themselves in being the more enlightened people, Canadian people. But the US, they don't have a lot of knowledge about Canada. They don't get Canadian news channels, and they don't know, they've hardly ever visited Canada, or they know anyone that's visited Canada. So they don't get a lot of information about Canada, but they see themselves as they see Canadians as quite similar to Americans, or they see Canadians as basically Americans, and they see Canada as their 51st state. So those are not correct assumptions. I believe that they're quite similar in many ways, but they're also quite different. So the US society is more of a melting pot, whereas Canada is more, the Canadian society is more of a mosaic. So in the US, you have all these different ethnicities and cultures, and they all come together, but they form this one American way. So that's called a melting pot. Whereas in Canada, you have all these ethnicities and all these cultures come together in Canada, but there's no one Canadian way of doing things. If you look at Vancouver, it's more of an Asian city, whereas if you go to Toronto, it's more of a South Asian city. You go to Quebec, it's more of a French community. So all of these cities are quite different from each other, and there's different flavors. There's no one Canadian way of doing things. You see all these cultures blend in together, and sometimes there's not overt racism, but there is, tensions between different ethnicities within, but it's not, I mean, Canadians are more polite in that sense that they don't ridicule people on their faces, but there might be some underlying tensions between different groups in Canada, but it's not shown that much. So I believe in Canada, people are able to live in their own communities and live the way they want to, without adopting a predominantly Canadian culture. I mean, just look at, the national languages of Canada and the US. In Canada, you have French as well as English being the national language, whereas in the US, the official language is English, even though there's a lot of Hispanic people in the US, and Spanish is predominantly spoken, but they never introduced Spanish as an equivalent to English. So in the US, you're supposed to speak English, whereas in Canada, there's a lot of places, especially in Quebec and a lot of other pockets within different provinces where you can get by just speaking your own language. In Vancouver and Richmond, BC, you might be able to survive on Mandarin or in Punjabi, whereas there probably wouldn't be any place in the U.S. where you could just survive on Spanish. You could, but on an official language level, you need to know English. So some of the other differences and similarities that I see between Canada and the US. Thank you.